My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
This month we start what should be a 4-part series detailing the life of a woman who simply could not be broken. Try as they might, Elizabeth Packard, the main character in this tale, refused to break. She just kept fighting no matter what obstacles were put in her way. Her husband tried to control her and he failed, so he had her locked up in an insane asylum where the head doctor tried his best to get her to submit and he too failed. Despite spending years in such a facility, Elizabeth Packard never gave up the fight, and then once she was released, she kept fighting. She fought to prove that she was and always had been sane. She fought to get the children her husband had stolen from her back. She fought to save other women who had suffered the same fate as she did, and she fought to ensure that no others in the future would have to endure what she had. Yet before we get into the story of fierce resistance against unimaginable odds, first, like always, I want to give credit to my sources, which primarily are Kate Moore's excellent The Woman They Could Not Silence, Barbara Sapp Inslee's The Private War of Mrs. Packard, and Jeffrey L. Geller and Maxine Harris's Women of the Asylum, Voices from Behind the Wall 1840 to 1945. And like always, these and any additional sources like websites that I use in putting these episodes together will be listed on this podcast Twitter and Ko-fi pages, links to which are in the description. And with all that being said, let's begin. The woman who became known to the world primarily as Elizabeth Packard had been born Elizabeth Parsons Ware in western Massachusetts on the 28th of December 1816. Elizabeth was the daughter of Reverend Samuel Ware and his wife Lucy Parsons, who lived in the industrial town of Ware, Massachusetts, a name which oddly enough had no relation to the Ware family but was instead named after the river the town was built next to. As for Reverend Samuel Ware, he and Lucy had actually gotten married late by the standards of the day, seeing as how he was 29 and Lucy was 31 when they wed. Things, however, would not be easy for the couple, as while Elizabeth was technically their 5th child, she was also the first to actually survive. Unsurprisingly, then, Elizabeth's mother Lucy was known to have what was characterized as emotional outbursts. These incidents would later be used as evidence against Elizabeth, with the claim being that mental illness ran in the family, when the reality was, more than likely, this was simply a woman reacting to the tragic death of 5 of her 8 children. Since, in addition to the 4 children she had lost prior to Elizabeth, Lucy would give birth 3 more times, with 2 sons managing to survive while a third died within 2 months of his birth. Seems to me, then, that this was less of a case of mental illness and more a woman who could have used some counseling to deal with the tremendous losses she had suffered. As for their surviving children, they would all, including Elizabeth, receive top-notch schooling, as Samuel Ware was apparently a firm believer in education. Indeed, he would make sure that all the children under his care, including the girls, received the best education possible. This included not only his own 3 children, but his sister Susanna's daughter Angelina. You see, Susanna would die suddenly and her husband would abandon his family, leaving their 6 children to be taken in by Susanna's surviving relatives, with Samuel and Lucy taking in Susanna's daughter, who was the same age as their own Elizabeth. The 2 little girls then formed a tight bond, with Elizabeth calling Angelina her adopted sister for the rest of her life. Angelina, like Elizabeth then, would receive a full education. Indeed, Elizabeth would proudly state that she got the same education as her brothers. In particular, she would attend the Amherst Female Seminary, where she studied algebra, the classics, and French. She really seemed to have a passion for learning, and her teachers were reported to have praised her as the best scholar. This love of learning seems to have been fostered at least in part by her experiences at home, as her father regularly hosted gatherings focused on stimulating conversations on a wide variety of subjects. These were opportunities for free exchanges of ideas. Elizabeth then was able to regularly bear witness to discussions concerning religion, philosophy, politics, and various societal issues. Following her schooling, Elizabeth, like her mother before her, went on to become an educator herself, when at age 16 she started teaching small children. Indeed, by 1835, the 19-year-old Elizabeth was apparently serving as the principal of Randolph College, a school that boasted that it hired only the best educators. It was at this point, however, that Elizabeth suffered what doctors at the time called a brain fever, a term that appears to have been a kind of vague catch-all diagnosis for a number of symptoms, which has no direct correlation to any recognized disease today. Basically, any number of things could be attributed to this diagnosis. For example, in Elizabeth's case, she reportedly would be left delirious for a span of 3 weeks, during which time the quote-unquote doctors attempted to treat her through their normal methods which included purging and bloodletting, cures which surprisingly did not take, and cures which Elizabeth herself would actually later blame for her condition, as she believed that the initial bleeding and the quote-unquote medicine she was given were the actual reasons for her prolonged illness. Regardless of the cause, in their desperation, Elizabeth's parents would have her hospitalized in a Worcester State Hospital, which was New England's first public psychiatric institution. Elizabeth was sent there in part because her father blamed her illness on, quote, too much mental effort, resulting from her job as a teacher. This, you see, was a commonly accepted diagnosis of female maladies during that era, as it was essentially a way for the male-dominated society to police women who dared to step outside the accepted gender norms. Now, I'm not saying that's what her father was doing in this case. I'm just saying the reason why he believed in such a diagnosis and why it was accepted was a result of such clearly biased beliefs. Essentially, women were proving that they were just as capable of learning as any man. So, a certain subset of doctors, due to their own biases, blamed virtually any illness suffered by a woman participating in any non-acceptable field as being a result of her unusual occupation. To note, it wasn't just women pursuing education or careers that might tax their minds who risked receiving such a diagnosis either. Indeed, the quote-unquote pernicious habit of reading novels was determined to be a potential cause of insanity, based upon the belief that such a habit might cause women to fantasize and live in a state of derangement. Doctors at the time were also obsessed over women's periods, with the idea being that any deviation from the quote-unquote norm in a woman's menstrual cycle was potential evidence of a diseased mind. Some doctors even encouraged parents to delay their daughters' periods to avoid having to deal with such madness-causing bodily functions as long as possible. Their prescription for delaying such natural processes involved taking cold baths, not eating meat, and not sleeping in feather beds. It was also suggested that girls not read novels as a way of delaying their periods as well. Now, to be clear, this connection between mental illness and female biology was not new. Apparently, in fact, it dated back centuries, as documents from 1900 BC have been discovered in which it stated that women become insane as a result of where their uterus was located in their body. You see, the apparent belief was the uterus actually moved about inside a woman's body. Their moods and their very sanity then would change as a result of where the uterus was located at any given moment. To combat this and to get the rogue organ back to its proper place, women were instructed to inhale powerful scents that would influence the movement of the uterus, a concept that would reportedly eventually give birth to smelling salts. Indeed, as author Kate Moore points out, the term hysteria actually owes its name to this theory, as it comes from the ancient Greek word for uterus. As for Elizabeth, she would be hospitalized for 6 weeks in Worcester, during which time she recovered from whatever illness was actually plaguing her. This hospitalization, however, would also be used as evidence against her by her eventual husband, one Theophilus Packard Jr. Theophilus, who had been born on the 1st of February 1802 in Shelburne, Massachusetts, was, like Elizabeth, the child of a pastor. Unlike Elizabeth's family, the Wares, however, it does not seem as if the Packards had the same tragic luck with their children. That being said, Theophilus's father, much like Elizabeth's, seemed to have been a strong believer in education for all, as he helped to found both the Amherst College for Men and the Mount Holyoke College for Women. Yet despite this, unlike Elizabeth, young Theophilus was not particularly noted for his own scholarly pursuits. Now, the Packards were a deeply religious family, with Theophilus Sr. being a particularly famed figure known as the Sage of Shelburne within the church. Theophilus Jr. then was groomed to follow in his father's footsteps, even though he himself did not seem to be particularly religious in his youth. Indeed, it was reportedly only during his senior year in Amherst College that Theophilus seemed to find religion, a series of events that seemingly started when one of Theophilus's more unrepentant classmates had a conversion experience after attending one of the revivals that was so common in those days. Hearing of this experience seemed to have seriously shaken Theophilus, who started worrying about his own, quote, sins and state and prospects. Theophilus was so concerned that he spent the following week not sleeping and not really eating, as he skipped his classes to read his Bible over and over, all the while begging for God's mercy. After a week of this decidedly unhealthy and obsessive behavior, the young man then experienced his own conversion experience, at which point he dedicated himself to the service of God and in doing so, made his decision to attend the Princeton Theological Seminary, a stronghold of Calvinist teachings. Now, to understand Theophilus, to some extent you have to understand that this was an era marked by people questioning a number of long-standing and thus accepted beliefs. Among other things, people were questioning the passed-down wisdom of only landowners being able to vote, as people were now demanding more of a say in their own government, while others started having some even more radical ideas like the well-established and deeply ingrained institution of slavery being wrong, or ideas like how women should be independent and have a say in their own lives and in society, regardless of whether they were married or not. Even traditional religious philosophies were being questioned, and new sects of Christianity were being established. Not even Theophilus's Presbyterian Church was immune from such change, as it was split between adherents to so-called Old School and New School Calvinism, with the so-called New School adherents being generally more accepting of other denominations, while also rejecting the idea of predestination as the be-all and end-all. The idea of predestination being, in short, the concept that only a select small number of people throughout all time will ever make it into heaven, and whether one is among those select few was decided by God before you were even born. As such, the vast majority of people were damned and no one had any real control over their lives or their own actions. Everything had already been preordained. The Old School was then a very much fire and brimstone type of faith, and it was one Theophilus was steeped in due to his time in Princeton. Theophilus then very much seems to be a man of tradition, a man who believed the world was the way it was because of God's will, and thus it shouldn't be questioned. For a time, though, he would be a minister for New School denominations, but he seemingly never lost his fire and brimstone tendencies. In the meantime, as Theophilus began his work as a pastor, he also started looking for a wife, which is where Elizabeth re-enters the picture, as the 37-year-old Theophilus in 1939 would marry the 22-year-old Elizabeth. The pair had to some degree or another known each other for some 12 years at this point, since Theophilus and his father were colleagues of her father. That being said, this does not seem to have been much of a romantic match. Indeed, in Elizabeth's estimation, Theophilus, quote, did not seem to love me much. Now, it's not like Elizabeth was lacking in prospects. She reportedly had a number of suitors, including, according to rumor at least, the likes of Henry Ward Beecher. As for Theophilus, she had seemingly never really thought of him in such a way. To her, he was her father's friend and compatriot, not a prospect for her affections. So his sudden proposal came as a surprise. The pair would have a brief courtship, during which time she recalls going to kiss Theophilus on the cheek, a move that required her to stand on her tiptoes to accomplish, as the man who had proposed marriage to her made no move to shift his head to his sister in such a show of affection. It was as if he couldn't be bothered, as he was uninterested. Yet, despite this, Elizabeth would agree to marry Theophilus, largely in an effort to, quote, please my pa. Elizabeth also accepted this arrangement because she was very much steeped in the ideas and propaganda of the day. Primarily, I'm talking about the idea of women marrying men to be their protectors and providers. When looking at Theophilus then, based upon her knowledge of his father and his connections to her own father, she expected him to be very much the same type. As such, for years she also accepted her husband as the unquestioned head of the household, as she willingly followed his lead while she looked to fulfill her duties as a wife. A duty that she saw as being akin to the moon reflecting the light of the sun. As such, for years Elizabeth would state that the height of her ambition was to simply make her husband happy. The thing was, try as she might, the two were simply not a good match. Elizabeth, you see, was a naturally curious, outgoing, and sociable woman, while in contrast, Theophilus was better described as gloomy, nervous, and lacking in self-confidence. As a result, Elizabeth would describe their union as, quote, cheerless. Indeed, she felt that her husband was, quote, totally indifferent toward her, and she believed that he did not, quote, know how to treat a woman. It seems quite obvious then that Theophilus's choice to get married was simply a pragmatic decision. Ministers, you see, traditionally had wives, and so as a minister himself, logic said he should have a wife. Theophilus then was seemingly not exactly a caring or affectionate husband. Indeed, if anything, it seems like domineering might be the best way to describe him, as he occasionally confiscated his wife's mail as well as refused to allow her to speak to friends that he deemed to be a bad influence. On one occasion, he even threatened to sue a male acquaintance of Elizabeth's $3,000 for writing to her without his permission. Still, it does not seem as if Elizabeth ever said anything publicly against her husband. In fact, she was reportedly the peacemaker in their marriage, as she thought that she would, quote, rather yield than quarrel any time. As such, Theophilus became for all intents and purposes the lone and deciding voice in their marriage. Yet, while Elizabeth did not find much real happiness in their union, she would find joy in the result of said marriage, as she became a devoted mother to their 6 children, each born a respectable 2 to 3 years apart. Their first child was a son they named Theophilus III, but who was more often than not called Toffee. Toffee was then followed by another son, Isaac, who in turn was followed by their 3rd son, Samuel. Their 4th child would then be their only daughter, who was named after Elizabeth, but would typically be referred to as Libby. After Libby came George and finally her youngest child, Arthur. Elizabeth loved and doted on all her children, as she called them things like her, quote, jewels, and her, quote, sun, moon, and stars. She was totally dedicated to her children and their happiness. Elizabeth Packard then was, from all accounts, the very image of the prototypical wife and mother of that era, as in addition to the work of raising and educating her children, she also did work around the house like dusting, feeding the hens, gathering their eggs, tending the vegetable garden, and dipping candles. She also cleaned and repaired the clothes belonging to her sizable family, which was no easy task in an era before sewing and washing machines. She also had to periodically air out and fluff all the beds in the house, in addition to cooking multiple meals for her family daily. Indeed, she was said to have been an excellent cook. Now, as far as I can tell, none of this would change. Elizabeth would continue to be a devoted mother and homemaker, as she took pride in both her children and her work maintaining their household. What would change, however, is that following the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, the concept of women's rights started becoming a topic of national conversation, a topic that also made its way into the Packard household. Yet husband and wife took vastly different positions on the issue, with Elizabeth coming to believe that, quote, wives are not mere things, they are a part of society, while Theophilus took the stance that, quote, a woman has no rights that a man is bound to respect. The thing was, it seems, the more charismatic, more well-spoken, and just in general deeper thinker Elizabeth tended to come out on top of such discussions. Now, for Elizabeth, these discussions may have seemed akin to the kind she listened to her father and his guest have during her youth. Conversations that never became arguments and that never left any sore feelings when they were over. Conversations that were simply a free exchange of ideas. Theophilus, though, seemed to have been incapable of having such discussions, as he seemingly took these so-called defeats personally. This led to a growing sense of unease in their marriage that was, in my estimation, largely the result of the fact that Theophilus had grown used to being unchallenged. He was so used to being the only voice in their marriage that when Elizabeth began to vocalize her own opinions that differed from his own, Theophilus simply could not handle it. Indeed, he would comment later, quote, my wife was unfavorably affected by the tone of society and zealously espoused almost all new notions and wild vagaries that came along. Theophilus, you see, did not seem to like a lot of the new ideas and the potential for societal change they brought. He was seemingly very much a man of traditions. He liked things the way they were. He then did not like these new ideas or the prospect of his wife bringing them up in his home. Elizabeth, meanwhile, got to sense that as much as anything else, her husband was jealous of her, as she believed that he feared that she might, quote, outshine him. However, the thing that she sensed got under his skin the most was her growing belief that a woman and a wife such as herself had just as much right to have an opinion of her own as her husband did. Or, as Elizabeth herself put it, quote, I have got a mind of my own and a will too, and I will think and act as I please. Where, in contrast, Theophilus held on strong to the scripture that ordered wives to obey their husbands. So, seemingly the seeds of their issues had already been sown to some extent when in 1854, the Packard family packed up and left Massachusetts behind as they headed for the open prairies of the Midwest. They would settle first in Lyme, Ohio for a year before moving on to Mount Pleasant, Iowa for a couple of years before finally settling in Manteno, Illinois, where Theophilus would be employed by the local Presbyterian church, with author Barbara Sepp Inslee suggesting that a reason for these frequent moves being the result of the various church congregations growing tired of Theophilus's fire and brimstone preaching style. Elizabeth, meanwhile, as she and her family settled into their new home in Manteno, Illinois, became even fiercer in her determination to be an individual who was free to do, think, and speak as she wanted without interference, an idea she would summarize in the statement, quote, no man shall ever rule me, for I ain't a brute made without reason. As a consequence of this free thinking, Elizabeth began disagreeing with Theophilus when it came to his preaching, something she had seemingly never done before. Things, though, had come to a head when his Presbyterian church switched from preaching the doctrines of the New School to revert back to the tenets of the Old School. For Theophilus, God was a distant and mysterious, essentially unknowable figure. As for mankind, he held on to the belief that everyone was damned unless they followed the specific creed of his church, and even then one could never be sure if one would see heaven when all was said and done, as he also believed in the elect and predestination, meaning that only a select few would be saved, and that had been determined by God long before your birth. In contrast, Elizabeth saw God as a force of love. She also firmly believed that there was good in everyone. As such, she could not support her husband's belief that everyone was inherently bad and doomed to suffer for all eternity. This was especially true when it came to her children, as they had run to her crying after their father explained to them how they were all born wicked and doomed to a fiery hellish fate after their lives were over. At which point Elizabeth would comfort her children and tell them, quote, "Don't be deluded into the lie that you are bad." Elizabeth, you see, especially since becoming a mother, simply could not understand nor condone the idea that God would just proclaim that a newborn or even a babe still in the womb was going to be either saved or condemned to hell. It was just an unconscionable idea for her, plus she had seen how much it upset her cherished little ones. Theophilus, however, did not see this as a mother comforting her children. Instead, he saw it simply as a wife, a woman, undermining her husband, a man, an outrageous thing. Plus, she was undermining what he saw as the true word of God and teaching his children false beliefs. In doing so, she was essentially guaranteeing their damnation by teaching them a creed that was different from his own. Now, this was crime enough for Theophilus, but what was worse was Elizabeth did not keep her newly outspoken nature and her disagreements with her husband's religious teachings confined to their home. You see, Theophilus's church, as a part of their switch to the more conservative Old School creed, started holding Bible classes to educate the congregation and convince them to accept this change. For her part, though, Elizabeth could not understand or accept this switch, and so she used these classes as an opportunity to speak her mind on the matter, a choice that would lead to a number of developments in Elizabeth Packard's life that she never could have anticipated. The first of which being how enjoyable and engaging she found this experience of crafting and delivering well-thought-out arguments on an issue she was deeply passionate about. You see, these classes and her statements provided Elizabeth with what was really the first opportunity she had to use her mind in such a manner since her marriage. As a result, it was like a revelation for Elizabeth, who had for years been more or less completely focused on homemaking and child-rearing. She even began writing out her statements that she would deliver during the classes. The creation of these essays in particular brought Elizabeth great joy, as she got to compose her thoughts and her arguments. As you might expect then, after putting so much thought and effort into her preparation, Elizabeth quickly became a powerful force in these discussions. She was quite persuasive, as her natural charm combined with the fact that oftentimes she was better educated and more well-read than her neighbors who had been born and raised in these more frontier regions, individuals who then lacked the access to the established centers of learning that Elizabeth had enjoyed in her youth. Theophilus, though, found no joy in the pride and satisfaction his wife took in participating in these Bible class discussions, as from his point of view she was effectively working to undermine him, as he obviously supported the change of the Old School teachings. It was bad enough that the pastor's own wife was not agreeing to the change, but it was worse still because she was naturally more persuasive than he was. As a result, Theophilus asked Elizabeth to stop attending the church's classes. Now, Elizabeth was willing to do as he asked, provided that she had the opportunity to inform the class that her husband was asking her to do so, and she was acquiescing to his will. This, however, was not good enough for Theophilus. He wanted his wife to lie and tell the congregation that it was her idea to stop fighting against the change. Elizabeth, though, could not do that, as she refused to be a hypocrite. It was one thing to stop publicly resisting the change, but it was another to lie and say that she supported it. Now, it's important to realize the Mantenos Church switch from the New School doctrine to the Old School had more behind it than just the preferences of its pastor. While Theophilus, due to his Princeton education, was steeped in the Old School traditions and thus likely preferred that particular theology, there was another reason for this change, one that Elizabeth had absolutely no clue about. You see, in addition to the differences I've already mentioned, the Old School doctrine took no firm stance on the questions of slavery and abolition, a question that was quite important in the United States in the late 1850s. This lack of a stance on the issue of slavery and abolition for Elizabeth was yet another mark against the old school doctrine, as she was a firm believer that the enslaved should be set free, a stance that the more progressive New School doctrine also supported. Now, this had not been something the couple had ever disagreed upon before, as Theophilus, like Elizabeth, had been a supporter of abolition ever since he first saw an enslaved person during a trip to Kentucky he took in 1835. It was a disturbing sight for Theophilus, as he held that a person could not own another because that would mean you also owned their soul, something that could only belong to God. It was with this belief then that following this trip to Kentucky, Theophilus returned to Massachusetts, where he began lecturing against slavery, something that on the surface made his endorsement of the Mantenos church's switch from the more progressive New School doctrine to the more conservative Old School one seem unusual. After all, by pointedly taking no stance on the matter of slavery, the Old School doctrine was seen as tacitly endorsing the South's peculiar institution by not condemning it for the great evil that it was. Now, what Elizabeth did not know was this doctrinal switch just happened to coincide with the Manteno Church securing the money it needed to construct a physical building, which it had apparently lacked up until this point. Money that primarily came from a single individual who had personally donated $800, an amount roughly equivalent to $30,000 today. The individual in question happened to be one Cyrus H. McCormick, who was one of the richest men in the country at the time. Most importantly, though, McCormick was one of a number of individuals who was determined to preserve the Union by stopping all that troublesome talk of abolition and the evils of slavery. You see, to McCormick and others like him, it wasn't the slave owners who were the problem, or even the numerous Southern firebrands screaming for secession. No, the problem was the troublesome abolitionists and all their talk about how evil slavery was. To that end, McCormick looked to push the Old School doctrine in churches all across the country, using his money to ensure that anti-slavery ministers were forced out and replaced by those who either supported the South's peculiar institution or those who at the very least knew to keep quiet about the issue. In Manteno, this task was especially easy for McCormick to accomplish, since the head of the local church, one Deacon Spring, was actually close friends with the wealthy man. This then was a change coming from the top down, which was why they had felt it necessary to hold the Bible classes to convince the members of the congregation to go along with the move. As for Theophilus, he was more than willing to play along with this scheme, as despite his previous anti-slavery leanings, he had, as previously mentioned, been steeped in the Old School creed throughout his education. More importantly, though, even if he was actually inclined to stand up for his anti-slavery beliefs, Theophilus could not afford to lose his job as other abolitionist pastors had, seeing as how he was actually deeply in debt, something else that Elizabeth was completely unaware of. To begin with, the $500 a year he was paid by the church was really not enough for a family of 8 to survive upon. Plus, it did not help matters that the Panic of 1857 had made it all but impossible for the Packards to sell their former residence in Mount Pleasant. So, to keep his wife and everyone else from knowing of these hardships, Theophilus started borrowing money at 30 to 40% interest, which only gave him more payments that he could not make. As a result, by the time McCormick and Deacon Spring came to him with their proposal to switch the church to the Old School philosophies, Theophilus was some $3,800 in debt, an amount roughly equivalent to $142,000 today. Theophilus then, even if he had any intention of doing the right thing, and based upon what we know about the man I have my doubts that he did, the reality was the pastor simply could not risk losing his job at a time when he was already in so much debt. Which is why it was so important for Theophilus to silence Elizabeth, and why he felt so compelled to do so by any means necessary. This then is seemingly what first led him to warn Elizabeth that if she did not conform to his wishes, especially when it came to his church, and stop her criticisms about the change, he promised to put her in an asylum, a threat that he notably first made after she voiced pro-abolition sentiments to Deacon Spring, his boss, who was friends with the wealthy McCormick, who wanted to silence such talk. For her part, Elizabeth, knowing none of this, could not believe that her husband was actually serious. There was no way he would put her in an asylum just because she dared to have her own thoughts. He would not, could not have her declared insane and locked away just because she gave voice to said thoughts that did not align perfectly with her husband's. She was an American after all, which meant she was protected in being able to believe as she saw fit, especially on matters of religion. Her husband, she believed, was simply using the same over-the-top rhetoric that critics of women's rights advocates use when calling them, quote, fugitive lunatics. Indeed, any real fears that she might have harbored about her husband actually being serious were alleviated, at least for a time, after she spoke with their neighbor, a Mr. Comstock. He was a lawyer, you see, and he assured Elizabeth that she could not be hospitalized without a trial, and in his opinion, there was no way a jury would ever commit her. Now, according to Comstock in general, most states at the time basically allowed families free rein to institutionalize their relatives, with the idea being that they would only do something like that because their family members actually needed help and treatment. The family members, the thinking went, would have no other motivation to institutionalize one of their own. Plus, it was also generally assumed that there was no way people could be misdiagnosed as being insane, so there was no reason for the state to interfere by requiring things like trials. Illinois, where they now resided, however, was different, as the state had recently passed a law requiring an official trial with a 6-man jury before someone could be committed. This information eased Elizabeth's fears quite a bit, as she was confident that given the opportunity to speak and prove herself in court, there was no way she could be found insane. Ultimately, though, Elizabeth would stop attending and speaking in the Bible classes, but not because of her husband's request, but because their children took ill from some unidentified illness. So Elizabeth turned her attention away from the church as she focused fully on caring for her ailing children. Yet, while his wife was busy caring for their seriously ill children, Theophilus began his public campaign against her. Potentially still fearing how much damage Elizabeth had caused, the pastor looked to undermine his wife and her arguments by telling his congregation that her statements were nothing more than a result of a, quote, diseased brain. He further laid this groundwork when he took to telling their neighbors that Elizabeth was suffering from a, quote, attack of derangement. For proof of these claims, Theophilus simply pointed to Elizabeth's change in temperament. According to Pastor Packard, Elizabeth used to be a model obedient wife who never disagreed with him, her husband, in their home, much less in public, an argument that made sense to the people, or at least to the men of the day. After all, it was seen as unusual for a wife to speak out against her husband, or to even think of being anything other than a faithful, obedient wife. This was the era of the quote-unquote true woman, which was a male-created ideal of womanhood. The so-called true woman was delicate, timid, modest, and sweet. The true woman maintained this neat, tidy, and most importantly, pleasant outward appearance, regardless of circumstances and the hard work she had to endure to maintain her household. The true woman was also fully dependent and in need of protection, guidance, and economic support from men to survive. This image of the true woman was one very much supported in the popular fiction of the day. This included popular tales that centered around passive and submissive women who managed to assert/achieve some limited amount of power/influence within the walls of their own homes. Advice books for women and early women's magazines like Godey's Ladies Book also worked to popularize and support this image of the true woman. This, then, was how women were expected to act. Indeed, it was seemingly natural for women to behave this way. As such, any woman who deviated from this accepted norm was seen as behaving unnaturally. Such behavior in and of itself then was potential proof of madness, and seemingly was even more true since Elizabeth seemingly hadn't had these impulses previously. Something then must have happened to make her act this way, with the obvious explanation being she had gone mad. The thing was, Elizabeth had long held these beliefs of personal independence, or at least some form of them. You see, even before her marriage she had written, quote, I shall rule myself, and if I ever get a husband, which article I never yet had the good fortune to get, but I am sure I shall sometime, I shall rule myself to obey my husband, because 'twill be my pleasure to do so. Essentially saying that she would obey because she wanted to, a belief that in time naturally grew into an understanding, for herself at least, that she need not always obey if she did not want to, especially if obeying violated some higher principle. This situation would only escalate when Elizabeth decided that the beliefs of her husband's church no longer aligned with her own. As a result, she started attending services at a local Methodist church instead. Such a thing was unheard of, a pastor's wife attending a different church. This threatened to completely undermine Theophilus and his credibility as a pastor if his own wife was not even willing to go to his church to hear him preach. It was then around this time that Elizabeth started noticing her husband having whispered conversations with his sister Sybil, conversations that suspiciously ground to a halt whenever Elizabeth came near. The greatest warning sign, though, seemingly came when Theophilus one day decided that he would no longer sleep in the same bed as his wife. Sure, he had never been the most affectionate of husbands, but this was a whole new low in their relationship. Soon Theophilus even invited another woman into their home, although not for the reason many of you might be thinking. Indeed, I think Elizabeth's assertion that her husband did not know how to treat a woman was quite apt. Theophilus then wasn't looking to replace his wife with this new woman. Instead, this woman was being brought in for the explicit purpose of spying on his wife to help him gather even more evidence to support his assertion that she was insane. Also of note, this new woman was brought in after Theophilus fired their maid following an incident when the young woman publicly stated, quote, "I can't see what Mr. Packard means by calling his wife insane, for she is the kindest, best woman I ever saw." If he wanted his wife locked away in an asylum, Theophilus could not have testaments like that getting out. So he fired the maid and in her stead brought in 23-year-old Sarah Rumsey, one of his devout parishioners. Now, Sarah was supposedly there to help with work around the house, a claim that really didn't make any sense, seeing as how Sarah was no servant. She was a teacher, and it's not like she needed the work either, as her family was quite well off. Things really got bad in the Packard household, however, when Theophilus locked Elizabeth in the ground floor nursery of their home, even going so far as to board up the shutters on the windows in that room. Now, Theophilus did this claiming this was for Elizabeth's health, as he asserted she needed to be, quote, "withdrawn from conversation and excitement," for her own good. This, he asserted, was the only way her diseased mind might rest and heal. Now, Elizabeth, who was not an idiot, never bought this excuse for a second. Her husband was trying to control her, plain and simple. It was obvious he didn't want her speaking out against him anymore. Her isolation then wasn't for her health, but because her husband feared that her, quote, "sane conduct might betray his falsehoods." Indeed, with Elizabeth now safely isolated and locked away, Theophilus was free to wage his ongoing campaign against his wife, her reputation, and her sanity. With Elizabeth unable to challenge him in any way, Pastor Packard began informing his parishioners of his wife's madness. The community, with nothing else to go on other than the word of their trusted pastor, took this accusation seriously, as they began considering all of Elizabeth's past and current behavior, actions, and words as they evaluated her in the minutest detail. Everything she had done, every expression she had made, everything she had said, and even how she had said it, was now put under a microscope as all these people with little else to do took to evaluating Elizabeth for signs of madness. Signs that, as author Kate Moore points out, are not all that dissimilar from the ones used to make accusations of witchcraft in centuries past. If you recall from my first episode on the Salem witch trials, in which I talked about the larger history of witchcraft, as Salem had its own uniquely weird motivations to some extent, the type of women typically accused of being witches were more often than not those who did not strictly obey the gender norms of their era. Women who dared to be outspoken and independent were historically the ones most likely to be accused of being witches. Yet, with the belief in actual witchcraft fading, such accusations did not disappear completely. Instead, such women were now being labeled as insane. The accusation of madness and its ties to expected womanly behavior was an especially insidious one, a fact that Elizabeth understood as she recognized that she could not actively take offense to such a charge, as should she raise her voice or do anything to challenge those who were whispering behind her back, or even openly calling her insane, such behavior on her part would only be seen as proof of her madness, as such an outburst was unladylike. Any behavior, then, that was not strictly in line with the accepted role of women was potentially more fuel for the accusations against her. For a fair number of the parishioners, though, Elizabeth had seemingly already given them plenty of evidence of her mental instability. She had, after all, publicly disagreed with her husband, their pastor. Plus, she had done so by choosing to address the Bible classes. Keep in mind, this was the era of the separate spheres, an idea that stated that men were supposed to inhabit the public sphere, while women were supposed to remain in the private sphere of their home. A woman speaking in public then was a sign in and of itself of nonconformity, which was of course also a sign of madness. Elizabeth's religious beliefs, which notably did not 100% line up with the church's doctrine, was also an especially potent sign of her madness for a number of her husband's parishioners, with her decision to leave the Presbyterian Church to join the Methodists being a sure sign of her insanity to some. Due to all of this so-called evidence, 39 of Theophilus's parishioners on the 22nd of May, 1860, signed a petition to have Elizabeth Packard, quote, "placed in an insane asylum as speedily as it can be conveniently done." Of this moment, Elizabeth would later write in seeming disbelief, quote, 40 men and women clubbed together to get me in prison, just because I choose to think my own thoughts and speak my own words." The situation continued to escalate when on the 16th of June a mock trial was held in Elizabeth's own home. The trial's goal was to determine her sanity or lack thereof, but with the likes of Deacon Spring overseeing the proceedings, it was not an unbiased affair. This trial was essentially just another opportunity for Theophilus and his allies like Deacon Spring to continue their campaign against Elizabeth. A seemingly successful campaign, as all those who gathered to take part in this trial agreed that Mrs. Packard was obviously insane. Well, everyone with the exception of a doctor who was in attendance who refused to sign such a pronouncement without actually examining the individual in question. For refusing to simply accept his word on such matters, Theophilus declared the doctor to be a quack, which honestly seems to be how the pastor dealt with anyone who dared to disagree with him on pretty much anything. The doctor had disagreed with him, so he must be a quack, just as his wife disagreeing with him was a sure sign that she was insane. Yet, while his complaints against the doctor did not amount to much, his accusations against his wife carried quite a bit of weight. Elizabeth and Theophilus Packard had been married for 21 years when all this started coming to a head. While many, including her own husband, turned against her, Elizabeth was not completely alone. Most importantly, she found comfort in her children, who remained completely devoted to her, never believing the accusations of insanity. Her young children, like 10-year-old Libby, in fact, had taken to sleeping with Elizabeth when their father had abandoned their shared bed. Her 16-year-old son Isaac, who Elizabeth described as her, quote, tender-hearted and devoted son, was perhaps her greatest offender, as he remained firm in his belief that the charges of madness being leveled against his beloved mother were, quote, wholly unfounded. Indeed, it would be Isaac who got into contact with his older brother, 18-year-old Theophilus III, more commonly known by his nickname Toffee, to inform him of what was transpiring. Toffee, you see, was by this point living in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. As a result, he had not been aware of what was happening back at home. Isaac was also key in helping to organize a resistance against his father's machinations. You see, while Theophilus held sway over his loyal parishioners, not everyone in Manteno had turned their back on Elizabeth. In fact, she was quite the popular figure among more than a few people in town. Elizabeth, you see, due to her very friendly, caring, and outgoing personality, had made a number of friends over the years. With Elizabeth locked away in the nursery, then it was up to Isaac to enlist the support of these people and the community at large, taking advantage of his job at the local store, which was regularly visited by any number of local townsfolk to do so. Essentially, the situation was the church parishioners, especially those who supported the shift to the old-school doctrine, generally sided with Theophilus, trusting the word of their pastor. They really did not know or interact with Elizabeth outside of the time she had spoken in their Bible classes. In contrast, many of the people who were much more aware of the Packard's home life, people who had seen the pair of them up close, people who got to see how Theophilus treated his wife, and especially people who got to know Elizabeth personally, disagreed wholeheartedly with the very suggestion that she might be insane. Among these friends and allies were families like the Haslets and the Blessings, who ran the local hotel in town. Yet these allies, loyal as they might be, were ultimately powerless against Elizabeth's husband and the authority he had over her life. Come the 18th of June 1860, only 6-year-old George and 16-year-old Isaac actually remained in the house by their mother's side, as Theophilus, just like he had isolated Elizabeth from the rest of the town, had one by one systematically isolated her from her own children, doing so under the veil of helping her out by relieving her of the burden of caring for them. Little Arthur was the first to go, as he was taken to Theophilus' sister Sybil, who, unlike Elizabeth, heeded and obeyed her brother in all things. Elizabeth's 10-year-old daughter Libby was then the next to go, when the parents of the 23-year-old maid/spy Sarah Rumsey suggested it might be good for the young girl to come and visit their own daughter, who was of age with her. This all happened gradually enough, but it was still very suspicious, as was the fact that on the night of the 17th, the day after the supposed trial to determine her sanity, Elizabeth witnessed Theophilus going through her trunks in an apparent search for something. What he was looking for she could not fathom. All she did know was this was behavior she had never known him to commit. These ominous signs then caused Elizabeth on the morning of the 18th of June to ask her loyal son Isaac to bring his sister and his little brother back home to her. She wanted her children there with her, perhaps thinking/hoping that their presence would stop their father from carrying through whatever vile plans he had for her. Isaac naturally promised his mother to do as she asked, after he ran an errand for his boss down at the store, Mr. Comstock. Elizabeth, who was proud of her son's dedication to his job, sent him on his way, knowing that the sooner he got started, the sooner he would bring his siblings back and the sooner she would feel more comfortable. In the meantime, young George returned to her room with a handful of strawberries he had picked for her in the garden. This sweet little scene between a mother and her young son, however, would be disturbed when Theophilus appeared, offering to take George down to the store to get some sugar plums. At this, Elizabeth could not help but feel worried. Was her husband purposely taking the last of her children away from her? Was this the next step in his wicked plan? Suspicious as she was, though, Elizabeth was careful not to cause a scene, as she knew it would do no good and would only play into her husband's plans. So as Theophilus took George down to the store, Elizabeth moved to take a cold sponge bath, as was her morning routine. She, however, wouldn't have a chance to finish her morning ablutions before she was disturbed by the sound of a lumber wagon pulling up outside her home. As Elizabeth peeked out between the slits in her boarded-up windows at the sudden unexpected commotion, she saw that her husband was there, but young George wasn't. Instead, in the place of her young son were 4 grown men, among whom was Deacon Dole, one of the heads of her husband's church, who was also his brother-in-law and firm ally. Sensing danger, Elizabeth swiftly moved to, for the first time personally, lock the door to the nursery that had served as her prison. After doing so, she hurried to get dressed, hoping to make herself presentable so as to not give her husband and his allies another excuse to call her insane, since a disheveled appearance was supposedly yet another sign of a disordered mind. That, however, was easier said than done, considering the elaborate Victorian clothes that were the style of the time. Elizabeth then had in no way managed to get properly dressed when her husband and his allies responded to finding the door to the nursery locked by taking an axe to it. Understandably terrified, Elizabeth leapt into her bed and covered herself up with her sheets, just as 2 men who were both doctors and members of her husband's church entered her room uninvited. These 2 men then marched right up to the terrified woman and pulled her out of her bed to take her pulse. Finding her heart racing, the 2 men then declared that Elizabeth was quite clearly insane, as clearly these men breaking into a woman's room with an axe were definitely not something to cause excitement or fear. At this pronouncement, Theophilus nodded approvingly, as he declared that they had now complied with the law. Thus, Elizabeth would now be taken away to the state insane asylum in Jacksonville, Illinois. For her part, Elizabeth declared this whole situation absurd, as she asserted she could not be committed without a trial. That, however, wasn't strictly true, and Theophilus knew it, as the information she had gotten from Mr. Comstock that had comforted Elizabeth wasn't quite the whole story. Now, to be fair to Comstock, maybe he had fully believed what he had told Elizabeth earlier. The problem with such an interpretation of the situation, though, is the fact that not only was Comstock a member of her husband's church, but he was also one of the 39 who had signed off on the petition declaring Elizabeth deranged. Furthermore, Comstock had seemingly assisted in her husband's plan on this day, as he made sure that their son Isaac, who was so loyal to his mother, was sent on a quote-unquote errand, thereby making sure he was not around when Elizabeth was carried off to be locked up in the insane asylum. Which, to be clear, in contrast to what Comstock had told her, Theophilus was fully in his rights to do, as the law that required a trial with a 6-person jury to judge whether someone was insane or not before being committed did not apply to married women. Married women, you see, according to the law at the time, were what is known as civilly dead, meaning that in the eyes of the law they were effectively dead. They were not citizens. In fact, they were not even really individuals according to the law, as when a couple were married, in the eyes of the law, they essentially became one person. That one person, though, was by definition the husband, as according to the law, he was the only one who existed anymore. For all intents and purposes, then, Elizabeth, in the eyes of the law, was her husband's property, meaning he was more or less free to do with her as he wished. Indeed, the Illinois law requiring a jury trial before an individual could be committed had a specific loophole built in. A loophole which stated that married women could be admitted without the same evidence required in other cases. As long as the medical superintendent of the institution agreed that she was insane, there was no need for a trial. It was in this moment on the morning of the 18th of June that Elizabeth Packard realized that her husband of 21 years had been fully and completely serious in his threat. He indeed fully intended to take everything away from her, the home she had made, her children, and even her very freedom, as he had her locked away in an asylum, simply for having her own thoughts and for daring to give voice to those that did not align with his own. Elizabeth, though, despite whatever fully justified panic and rage she may have been feeling internally, managed to keep a calm exterior. recognizing once again that acting out in any way would do her no good. If anything, any kind of protest or outcry could simply be treated as more proof that she was insane. It was then with this presence of mind that Elizabeth, still believing/hoping that at some point she would get the opportunity to defend herself against these ridiculous charges, looked to preserve the essays she had written for the Bible classes. She knew that those essays were the source of the accusations against her, and she also fully believed that any unbiased outsider upon hearing/viewing them would agree that they were the product of a clear and rational mind, not a diseased one like her husband and his allies claimed. Now, Elizabeth had taken some precautions by hiding them away, but faced with the reality of the situation and hoping for a quick resolution, she came upon the idea of hiding her essays away in the ample amounts of clothing she as a Victorian woman was expected to wear. To that end, she asked for everyone to leave her room so that she may finish bathing and dressing in private. Her husband, though, would not allow this, perhaps sensing that his clever wife had some plan in mind to try and spoil his scheme. Instead, Theophilus had his loyal spy Sarah Rumsey stay in the room. With this observer in place, Elizabeth dared not even approach the location where she had hidden her prized documents, lest she risk having them taken away and likely destroyed. Left with no other choice then, Elizabeth made herself presentable, knowing that again a disheveled appearance would do her no good, and only aid in her husband's case against her. It was also for that same reason why she would make no grand show of protest, and nor would she fight back. That being said, though, she would not willingly go along with them, choosing instead a more passive form of protest, as she calmly declared that she would never leave her children willingly. In doing so, she forced the doctors to physically carry her to the wagon. This wagon then transported Elizabeth, Theophilus, and his allies to the local train station, where they were all met by a surprise, as the train station unexpectedly was packed. Elizabeth's son Isaac, you see, had apparently learned of his boss Mr. Comstock's duplicity and his father's plans. As such, he then rallied all his mother's friends and allies, in the hopes that they would save her from being taken away. Clearly alarmed by the sight of so many who were not of a like mind with his goals, Theophilus turned to Elizabeth and said, quote, "Wife, you will get out of the wagon yourself, won't you? You won't compel us to lift you out before such a large crowd," acting as if he was trying to save her dignity and not his own. Elizabeth, though, was far smarter than that, as she replied, quote, "No, Mr. Packard, I shall not help myself into an asylum. It is you who are putting me there. I do not go willingly." Now again, Elizabeth had no intentions of causing a scene by shouting or physically resisting, lest she appear to give her husband's claims merit. At the same time, though, she was not going to give him the cover of making it look like she was doing this of her own volition. This was all her husband's doing, and so she wanted to make it clear for all to see that he was the one essentially kidnapping his own wife and putting her in an asylum. Elizabeth then was carried into the station while Theophilus's ally and brother-in-law Deacon Dole addressed the crowd, a situation that bolstered Elizabeth's hopes that her husband would not get away with what he was planning, as the supporters who had come to defend her greatly outnumbered Theophilus's little cadre. Elizabeth, however, was inside the station and did not hear Deacon Dole when he informed the crowd that the sheriff accompanying them had a warrant authorizing her committal. As such, he informed them that anyone who attempted to interfere with Elizabeth's transportation was liable to be arrested and jailed. The thing was, the man who was married to Theophilus's sister was lying through his teeth. The reality was they actually lacked such proper papers, so they didn't have the power of the law backing up their actions. In fact, the probate court that the sheriff had gone to in order to get the papers had found their proof of insanity wanting, and thus refused to issue said documents. Despite this, Theophilus and his allies, including the deacon and the sheriff, decided to just carry on without them. Unfortunately, no one in the crowd that day was aware that the threat of arrest and jail time was nothing more than a bald-faced lie. They were then very much too afraid to interfere. Elizabeth, however, knew nothing of this, and so as she sat in the station, felt relieved by the presence of so many friends and neighbors who had come out to support her, trusting that they would not allow her husband to get away with his dastardly plans. She was then stunned when the train arrived as she was once again carried out before the crowd, and not a single person stepped forward to put a stop to this miscarriage of justice. Elizabeth would scan the crowd desperately, meeting the eyes of people who were supposedly her friends and supporters as she pleaded for their intercession. Yet none of them stepped forth. All were seemingly too afraid of losing their own freedom to protect Elizabeth's. Indeed, the only person who was said to have risen their voice was her dear friend Rebecca Blessing, who shouted at the assembled crowd, quote, "Is there no man in this crowd to protect this woman? Is there no man among you? If I were a man, I would seize hold upon her." Yet still no one made a move, and so Theophilus and his allies continued on with their foul deeds, as Elizabeth would later write on this moment, quote, "All the oppressors asked or needed was neutrals." No one needed to physically sully their hands in aiding and abetting this cruelty. All Theophilus and his fellow plotters needed was for people not to step forward and fight back on his wife's behalf. It was at this point, as Elizabeth was carried onto the train, that she realized she had been effectively abandoned, a crushing realization. Worse still, though, was the thought that she was being forced to abandon her dear children. She feared what would happen to them without her there to look after and care for them. It was for these reasons that once she was locked away from view that Elizabeth, for the first time that day, broke down into tears. Speaking of her children, when they found out about what had happened to their mother, they were equally heartbroken. 10-year-old Libby, for example, like her mother, would break down into unconsolable tears when she found out. Indeed, it said she wept for days after her mother was taken, a profound loss that some suspect left a lasting impact on her health. 16-year-old Isaac, meanwhile, who had done all he could but still failed, in his grief would come down with a serious fever that led to delirium. Then there was little 6-year-old George, who just that morning had picked strawberries for his mother. When he found out what had happened, he tore away from those who had taken custody of him and rushed down to the train station, where he started running down the tracks after the train that he had been told had taken his mother away from him. Yet no matter how fast he ran, the train was already gone, and so was his mother. Theophilus then was not only treating his wife unimaginably cruelly, but he was also doing what many suspect to have been irreparable harm to his own children. The train carrying Elizabeth Packard and her husband would arrive in Jacksonville, which lay some 200 miles away from their home at 8 p.m. that night. Upon arriving, they headed straight for the location that Theophilus intended to be his wife's new home. The Illinois State Asylum and Hospital for the Insane, as well as its full name, was a massive structure. It consisted of a large center building that was flanked by 2 sizable wings, one for male patients and one for women, each filled with windows covered in bars. The structure stood some 5 stories high and was some 300 feet wide. Upon arriving, since it was already so late and since the superintendent, one Dr. Andrew McFarland, wasn't there, Elizabeth was escorted straight to the west wing of the facility where the women's ward was located. It was at this point that Elizabeth got her first real look at the asylum, as the hospital's exterior and interior were, suffice it to say, quite different. While the hospital was surrounded by 160 acres of well-maintained farmland, and its exterior was marked by stately columns that framed the entranceway, and its entrance hall where new arrivals and visitors were first greeted, all gave the place this very fancy, well-appointed air. That facade disappeared once one entered the wards proper. Behind the veil, all the fine furniture present in the entrance hall disappeared, replaced instead by far cheaper furnishings, while the air was filled with what Elizabeth would describe as a, quote, horrid and sickening stench. Specifically, Elizabeth was taken to the hospital's 7th ward, which, as was seemingly typical of many an asylum in those days, overcrowded. So, rather than being given a bed like all the other patients, Elizabeth was stuck in a small room with a narrow fold-out bed to lay on for the night. As it wasn't long after she had been escorted into the 7th ward that the asylum's bell rang signaling curfew, at which point all the patients were put into their rooms and all the lights were put out, leaving Elizabeth all alone in a small room some 200 miles away from her children. Indeed, this was probably the first time in 18 years that she wasn't under the same roof with at least one of her kids. She missed them all dearly and was also worried about them, as she had no idea who might be looking after them at this point. Meanwhile, Elizabeth found herself utterly surrounded by the phantom sounds of people crying, singing, screaming, and even laughing in an undescribably uncomfortable way. This was a profoundly unnerving situation, yet still she somehow managed to get some sleep, only to be awakened at 5:30 in the morning as the hospital's bell once again rang out, signaling the start of a new day. Elizabeth then joined the 28 or so other women who were patients in the 7th ward for breakfast in the dining hall, where they were expected to eat despite the ever-present smell of sewage, as the toilet facilities for the patients were located quite near said dining hall. Now, I'm not entirely clear on the state of indoor plumbing at this moment in history, although it does seem like around this time it was starting to become a thing in the US. That being said, I'm still not clear on the exact facilities the asylum had, but apparently it was an especially bad situation at this point, as reportedly due to a drought there was not enough water to flush the waste away to wherever it was supposed to go, thus resulting in a particularly terrible lingering stench. To be clear though, it seems like the wards in general always had a foul odor. It's just at this exact moment it was as bad as it could be. Yet despite this horrid state of affairs, Elizabeth's companions in the 7th ward were nothing like what she expected, although considering her own condition mayhap she should have expected this, as none of them seemed particularly mad. Indeed, Elizabeth found many of them to be well-educated middle-class married women. Now, this wasn't by happenstance, as doctors of the day typically group patients not just by their symptoms, but by their status in society. In other words, poor women were lumped in with other poor women, as they were considered vulgar and low class and best kept away from more refined and higher class individuals. Now, you would think the apparent presence of women who on the surface at least appeared quite sane themselves may have been a bit of a warning sign for Elizabeth, yet still she had some hope. She had so far only been admitted on the word of her husband, meaning she had not yet met, much less been examined by the asylum superintendent Dr. Andrew McFarland. Dr. McFarland was a highly respected figure in the world of asylums. He was a graduate of both Dartmouth College and Dartmouth Medical School, and in addition to being the superintendent of the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane, he was also the president of the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, all of which he achieved without having any formal training in psychiatry. Instead, he had essentially learned on the job. It was on this Dr. McFarland that Elizabeth more or less pinned her hopes. Surely, she thought, knowing full well that she was not actually insane, this expert doctor, upon meeting and speaking with her, would see right through her husband's lies and set her free. Indeed, after breakfast, Elizabeth would be escorted back to the hospital's reception room, where she was joined by her husband Theophilus for a meeting with Dr. McFarland himself. Elizabeth's husband, however, was seemingly largely left out of the conversation that primarily took place between Elizabeth and Dr. McFarland. Indeed, since she was meeting the doctor in the reception area instead of his office, Elizabeth believed this to be an indication that she was not actually a patient yet, and then still had the opportunity to prove herself sane. She even found their conversation quite engaging and even enjoyable, as the doctor seemingly allowed her to take the lead as they spoke on topics like religion, politics, and the, quote, progressive ideas of the age. Indeed, despite the doctor's high education, Elizabeth was seemingly his match, as she was able to converse with him on any subject he chose, with the only subject she avoided being that of her husband, as Elizabeth opted to not make any negative remarks about the man who was attempting to have her institutionalized, likely choosing to do so because she realized that a wife speaking ill of her husband would be treated as a symptom of a diseased mind. Once they were done speaking, Elizabeth was escorted back to the 7th ward, where an actual bed awaited her in her little room. Elizabeth's spirits, though, were high, as she was confident that after the interview, there was no way that the engaging and clearly intelligent Dr. McFarland could actually believe her husband's lies that she was insane. She was confident then that she would soon be departing this hospital to return to her children. What Elizabeth did not know, however, was that Dr. McFarland had already formally admitted her to the asylum. Indeed, she never really had any hope of not being committed, as in addition to her husband's own testimony, which carried extensive weight, Theophilus also had the testimony of 2 doctors, who testified to her quote-unquote derangement of mind. Now, one of these doctors was notably a member of her husband's church, who specifically cited her views on religious matters, views that were only notable because they did not align with his own, mind you, and her quote-unquote incessant talking as symptoms of her madness. The other doctor, meanwhile, had been thoroughly primed by Theophilus beforehand. As a result, he also cited her religious beliefs and her quote strong will as signs of her madness. So, basically, Elizabeth was being imprisoned in an asylum because she was strong-willed, because she liked to talk, and because of her religious views, which, mind you, were not unusual other than they did not align with her husband's. Not knowing this, when Theophilus visited her room the following afternoon to invite her to join him for a walk, Elizabeth actually expected him to tell her she was being released and he was taking her home. Instead, Theophilus just wanted to see if there was anything she wanted to say to him before he departed. Elizabeth was shocked at this. Even after everything he had done up until this point, she could still hardly believe that her husband actually intended to leave her, his wife of some 20 years, and the mother of his children, in an insane asylum just for thinking for herself. Understandably then, she vented some of her true feelings, protesting his cruel treatment of her. To which he replied sulkily, quote, "I hoped we should have a pleasant interview before we parted." Which was seemingly typical Theophilus behavior. He always saw himself as the victim. Even here in this moment when he was having her locked away, all he thought about was she was doing him harm. At this point, Elizabeth begged him to actually think of someone else, namely their children. They needed her. They needed their mother. Yet still he would not be swayed. Indeed, when he departed, according to Elizabeth, Theophilus seemed delighted beyond belief to leave her behind, as she would note, quote, "Never had I seen his face more radiant with joy." With her husband leaving and her fate seemingly sealed, Elizabeth returned to the 7th Ward, where she was greeted by the sympathetic women therein. These women rallied around Elizabeth, looking to comfort her, as they all knew how she felt in that moment, as many, you see, were there for the same reason that Elizabeth was. Their own domineering, petty tyrant husbands had committed them for daring to think and speak for themselves. Indeed, some had even worse tales to tell, as while some, like Elizabeth, had not been physically abused by their quote-unquote husbands, others had. There was in fact one woman there who had arrived at the hospital with half the hair pulled out of her head by her drunkard husband, and yet she was still admitted without a second thought. Elizabeth then, who seemed to make friends wherever she went, was no different here, regardless of the terrible circumstances they all found themselves in. Among the women she would grow close to was one Sarah Minard. Sarah, you see, was much like Elizabeth, a mother who was now deprived of her children. Sarah, in particular, had been institutionalized by her wealthy real estate mogul husband because she had dared to take an interest in spiritualism, which, as I covered in my series on it, was quite popular at the time and was especially attractive to women and early feminists in particular. Now, I should note, none of these women that Elizabeth encountered were black. Indeed, black people in general at the time were far less likely to be placed in insane asylums, something that was at least partially due to racial bias and the belief that only certain highly civilized types were affected by certain strains of insanity, basically saying black people were not civilized enough to suffer from certain mental illnesses. Indeed, it seems that the only really acceptable cause for insanity among black people in those days was freedom, with the inherent suggestion being that slavery was good for the mental health of African Americans, an assertion that they supported with the evidence of no enslaved person ever being sent to an asylum for treatment, ignoring the myriad of other reasons why that was true. As for Elizabeth, while she was coming to the realization that her situation was unfortunately far from as unique as she initially believed, she would be comforted by the fact that despite this, she was treated differently than her fellow patients. Indeed, she seemed to be treated more like someone who was simply renting a room than a patient. Elizabeth, you see, was given her own room and received no treatment, all the while also being exempt from rules that were applied to the other women. Rules like how they all had to set their clothes outside their rooms each night before being locked in so as to prevent escapes. Elizabeth, however, was able to dress how and when she wished, even though her husband steadfastly refused to send her best clothes to her. Additionally, she was able to freely borrow books from the hospital's library, and she was even given her own set of keys to the ward and allowed to walk the grounds of the asylum without an attendant. At times, Elizabeth was even allowed to escort some of the other patients on trips in the town with no one else in the hospital supervising their actions. As for Dr. McFarland, while he as the asylum superintendent would make his daily rounds checking in on the hospital's many patients, it seemed as if he made a special effort to check in on Elizabeth in the 7th Ward, something which she took great comfort in. The doctor, after all, was quite attentive, and he essentially offered Elizabeth for the first time in her life the opportunity to speak freely at length with an educated man. Plus, he seemed to be incredibly sympathetic with Elizabeth and her situation. As such, she came to see the doctor as being a, quote, man of honor, of intelligence, and of real worth. Now, this was not by accident, as Dr. McFarland's intention with his patients was to make himself the most trusted figure in their lives, a scheme that clearly worked during these early days, as the superintendent's visits were, quote, anticipated with the greatest pleasure by Elizabeth. Indeed, from time to time she was even invited to dine with Dr. McFarland at his table. Day after day then passed in this manner, until about a week in, Dr. McFarland actually informed Elizabeth that, quote, "I do not think you will remain but a few days longer." Elizabeth then had plenty of reason to not only hope but realistically expect that her stay in the asylum wouldn't be for long. To begin with, she had her own firm belief that she was not insane. Then she had her friends and allies from Montana who had promised they would try and get her out in a few days' time, and now she had this statement from the head of the asylum himself telling her that she shouldn't have to stay there long, which meant she would soon be returning to her beloved children. However, days continued to pass, and still Elizabeth remained. She was not idle, however. To try and fill her days, Elizabeth went to work in the asylum's sewing room. While this does seem to have been Elizabeth's choice, patients in the asylum were generally encouraged to take part in what was termed industrial therapy, which included working on the farm, in the kitchens, and the laundry in the sewing room, or being hired out as housemaids or carpenters, all of which was supposedly to help their healing process by giving them work. However, the reality was this was little more than a way for the hospital to make money, as the patients labored without any kind of pay while the hospital collected all the financial benefits of this work. Work which was, of course, divided by what was acceptable according to the class and gender norms of the day. The men worked on the farm and as carpenters, while the women worked in the laundry, the kitchens, or as housemaids. Higher-class women like Elizabeth were typically sent to work in the sewing room, as that was deemed acceptable labor for women of their class. Their labor, according to the asylum's own records, over a 2-year span resulted in a minimum of 997 pillowcases, 873 chemises, 767 dresses, 3,105 shirts, and 1,007 pairs of socks. Now, I said they produced at least this much because these women also produced other items like the restraining jackets that might potentially be used against the same women who had sewn them in the first place. Now, Elizabeth did not really mind this work. She was an expert seamstress, plus the sewing room was upon the 4th floor, which meant that its windows, since they were so high off the ground, were not barred so as to prevent escape. The unobscured view and the light coming in then was a welcome change from the rest of the institution. Additionally, her time working in the sewing room allowed Elizabeth to talk and spend time with Priscilla Hosmer, the hospital employee who was charged with overseeing the sewing room. Priscilla, you see, had a natural and genuine empathy for the patients at the hospital because her own sister had for a time been committed in such an institution. The connection between Priscilla and Elizabeth, though, went even deeper than that, as like so many others, Priscilla found herself becoming close friends with the charming and outgoing Elizabeth Packard. Elizabeth was actually working in the sewing room one afternoon when an attendant came to let her know she had some visitors, who turned out to be Isaac and Rebecca Blessing, some of her closest friends from Manteno, who were also accompanied by a Dr. Shirley. Dr. Shirley, you see, was there to personally examine Elizabeth, in the hopes of providing an expert opinion to counter the ones Theophilus had gotten to have his wife committed in the first place. Indeed, following his examination, Dr. Shirley would proclaim, quote, "She is the sanest person I ever saw." With this out of the way, Elizabeth and the Blessing spent the afternoon together, with Elizabeth showing them around the hospital and confiding in them that as hard as it was staying here, life with her husband in the months leading up to this point had actually been far worse. This naturally led the Blessings to ask her if she really wanted to return given what she had told them, to which Elizabeth responded she did because she longed to be back with her children. It's just now she recognized that when she got out, she was going to need to be protected from her husband and his dictatorial ways. Meanwhile, the Blessings assured Elizabeth that they were hard at work on her behalf. They had written lawyers, judges, and politicians in their attempts to get someone to listen to her story in the hopes that they would step in and have her released. They weren't putting all their eggs in that basket either, as should such attempts fail, they were making preparations to file a writ of habeas corpus, which is one of the foundations of American law, as it is designed to be a way to free those who had been confined unlawfully. The Blessings, you see, believed that by filing the writ, Elizabeth would have to be brought before a judge, who would then be compelled to rule on whether or not her incarceration was justified and legal, during which time Elizabeth would finally be able to defend herself and show that she was sane. As the day eventually came to an end, the Blessings left, promising as they did to write Elizabeth so as to keep her informed of their efforts and just to stay in touch. Yet as the days and weeks passed after their departure, Elizabeth received no letters. In fact, the only thing she received after her first month in the asylum was a trunk from Theophilus containing some more of her clothes. However, he continued to refuse to send Elizabeth her best dresses. Yet as distressing as this was, what was far worse was the realization that the trunk contained no messages from her beloved children, who she missed so dearly. Indeed, Elizabeth fretted over the fact that she had already missed Isaac's 16th birthday, and George's 7th was coming in just 5 days. It was then only after painstakingly going through the trunk and its contents that Elizabeth finally came across a small slip of paper that read in her darling Libby's handwriting, quote, "We are glad to hear you are getting better. Hope you will soon get well." One of her children had indeed written her, but the message, if anything, was even more distressing, as Libby had never before believed for a second that her mother was sick. This letter then suggested that without Elizabeth there to challenge her husband's lies, he was beginning to cause her children to doubt what they knew. There was, however, one of her children who was safe from their father's influence, her eldest son Toffee, who at 18 years old was living on his own and now preferred to go by Theo. Indeed, in August 1860, after Elizabeth had already been confined for 2 months, Theo would actually arrive at the asylum to check on Elizabeth himself. Now, to be clear, he had not actually seen his mother for a couple of years, having moved out well before any of this had happened. As a result, he was quite relieved to find that despite being institutionalized, Elizabeth was just as sane as she had been the last time he had seen her. Elizabeth was obviously overjoyed to get to see at least one of her children, as the pair spent the day together. Then Theo, before leaving, like the Blessings had done, also promised to do everything he could to get her out. For the time being, though, despite being a male relative, something that gave him the potential legal ability to have Elizabeth released, Theo was unfortunately just 18 years old, and legally he needed to be 21 to force the issue, so there was little he could do now. Yet as nice as it was to see her eldest son and to know that there was someone else out there who not only believed her sane but had promised to help her, Elizabeth did not want to wait 3 years to get out. She desperately wanted to go home to be there for her other children. Yet at the same time, she refused to be broken like a horse according to her husband's dictates. She would not go back to being a silent, obedient wife. She had a mind and will of her own, and she was not about to surrender that just because that's what Theophilus desired, because it was inconvenient for him to have a wife who did not agree with everything he said and believed. To that end, fearing that she had been abandoned by her friends in Manteno, seeing as how they, despite their promises, had sent her no letters with updates, Elizabeth turned her attention to convincing Dr. McFarland that she was indeed not insane. Surely, she thought, the wise, intelligent, benevolent doctor would eventually come to see that, without a shadow of a doubt, Elizabeth was not insane and never had been. Yet, while she was undertaking this campaign to show the good doctor that she did not belong in his asylum, she also began to have doubts about said asylum and the man who ran it. Doubts that she couldn't help but have despite her own status as the, quote, asylum favorite, who consistently received what Elizabeth herself characterized as, quote, almost queen-like attention. Indeed, it was during one of her walks around the asylum's grounds unescorted that Elizabeth heard her name being called. Elizabeth looked around confused, as there was no one else outside with her, at which point she realized the noise was coming from a window in one of the hospital's other wards. The women in this ward wanted to speak with Elizabeth because they had heard all about her and her remarkable status as the apparent favorite patient in the institution. For her part, Elizabeth, despite never meeting these women before, went to speak to them and listen as they told her in hushed tones about the various abuses they had experienced at the hands of the staff. Elizabeth found what they told her hard to believe, seeing as how she herself had never experienced or seen the like personally. Still, she could not just dismiss their concerns completely, so she instead counseled them to share their complaints with Dr. McFarland. He had treated her so well and had been such a good friend to her that she was confident he would set whatever was amiss straight. Elizabeth was then quite surprised when this advice brought the women no comfort, as they insisted that he knew full well about all the outrages taking place in his asylum. Indeed, some even claimed they had been placed in these lower wards as punishment by Dr. McFarland as punishment. Now, at this moment, Elizabeth still could not believe that any of this was true. Yet some doubts still began to creep in, especially when, after this encounter, a fence was built around the windows of the ward in question, and Elizabeth was instructed to not speak with those patients again. So, while Elizabeth continued to have faith in Dr. McFarland, she also swore to herself to act as a witness to the happenings in the asylum. After all, regardless of how true or not the testimonies of these women from the other wards might have been, Elizabeth was still reminded on a daily basis how her friends in the 7th Ward were just as sane as she was. Granted, though, the possibility remained that the doctors at the asylum could potentially be credited with her friend's recovery, as she had not known them when they had arrived, so as far as Elizabeth knew, they might have been worse and had since gotten better. Still, even in such a case, there was still the asylum's, quote, system of compulsory obedience and its myriad of punishments for Elizabeth to consider. You see, even from her seemingly privileged position within the asylum, Elizabeth could not help but note how the other patients were kept under constant surveillance, and how every aspect of their lives down to when and how they dressed, how long their hair was, and even their menstrual cycles were monitored and controlled by the doctors. Elizabeth also did not like the lack of empathy she witnessed from the staff, and nor did she like the way showing emotion by the patients was discouraged. For example, Elizabeth, upon seeing one of her fellow patients crying, moved to comfort her, while in contrast one of the asylum's attendants responded to the same situation by telling the woman they should not cry, as they were, quote, getting worse, as the attendant reminded the woman, quote, you can't go home until you stop fretting. Indeed, just saying you wanted to go home was discouraged, even though such a desire seems natural and logical. That being said, the most distressing thing for Elizabeth was when her fellow patients were told they wouldn't be allowed to go home until they stopped, quote, grieving and talking about their children, before being threatened with punishments if they didn't. None of this behavior by her fellow patients seemed at all insane to Elizabeth. From her perspective, these were all simply natural human emotions. Of course, these women wanted out of the asylum and wanted to return home, and of course the mothers wanted to see their children. In fact, even by the logic of the day, you would think these would be emotions that women were expected to have. Yet here in the asylum, such feelings were simply treated as if they were proof of mental illness. This wasn't even unique to this particular asylum either. Indeed, it seems likely this was accepted knowledge among such circles, as another woman by the name of Adeline T.P. Lunt, who was held in an unnamed facility in New England, would make similar complaints about how restricted the doctors were when it came to any expression of thought or emotion, writing, quote, too often are patients interrupted in an innocent original expression of thought by this rebuke. Come, don't talk so, that's crazy. For Adeline, asylums were all about crushing and stuffing out any bit of independence and individuality. Part of this is because the belief was one of the main causes of insanity was exaggerated emotions. It was then due to the same logic why no one really batted an eye at so many women being locked away in asylums, because the belief was women were more sentimental, impulsive, and emotional than men. By extension, then, they were more likely to suffer from insanity. Then, once they were labeled as insane, any expression of emotion was simply proof they were not yet cured. Elizabeth, however, could not accept this logic. So, in contrast to the hospital's uncaring staff, she started a prayer circle for her fellow patients in the 7th Ward. This then allowed the other women to share their feelings and concerns about their situations and about the hospital itself, with Elizabeth acting as their confidant and counselor of sorts. In doing so, she encouraged her friends to also share their concerns with Dr. McFarland, as she still trusted him and his honest desire to help and protect them. This, however, would only give her yet another perplexing doubt, when instead of listening and acting on their concerns, Dr. McFarland, when confronted with such uncomfortable news that his asylum was not perfect, tended to just turn away from the woman speaking to him as he moved on to the next patient. This was not the behavior of the caring and thoughtful man Elizabeth believed McFarland to be. Also concerning was the warning she received from her friend Priscilla Hosmore, the woman who oversaw the asylum's sewing room. Priscilla, you see, would take Elizabeth aside one day to warn her that if she ever wanted to get out, she was going to have to give up her prayer circle. Which was decidedly strange. How could providing comfort be wrong or be seen as insane? Elizabeth was a woman who very much wanted to see the best in people, and so she held on to the belief that Dr. McFarland was as kind and caring as he first seemed. She also very much wanted to believe her stay in the asylum would be a short one, even though it had already well outlasted his initial promise that she would be released any day. Unfortunately for Elizabeth Packard, she was quite wrong on both counts. Dr. McFarland was not the man she believed him to be, and nor would her stay be a short one. Instead, she would remain there for the better part of 3 years. Her time there, what she saw, and her fight to get out and prove her sanity, however, will have to, for now, remain a story for another time. Thank you for listening to Distorted History. If you would like to help out, please rate and review the podcast and tell your friends if you think they'll be interested. If you're feeling especially generous and would like to help keep this podcast going, please consider visiting my Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/distortedhistory and donating a few bucks. Anything you can give is greatly appreciated. I will be posting updates on future episodes and sources there in addition to posting them on Twitter as I usually do. With all that being said, once again, thank you for listening, and until next time.